Bite-sized ASL number 7, covering 3 topics from Chapter A, 1 from Chapter B, and 1 from Chapter C this time. So let's mount up and head out. Number 31, single man counters and control. Control can be a tricky topic in ASL and in Starter Kit as well. There are 3 types of control, or 3 things you can control on the battlefield. There is hexes, for example, controlling hex N5. There are structures, such as controlling this entire building. And then there are locations within said hex or structure, such as level 1 of this particular hex. This locations do not apply to Starter Kit, so you SK players can ignore this part. And the way control works can be a little tricky between the 3. In other words, if you have a unit that runs into this building and there are no enemy units in there, he automatically controls that entire building. But he only controls that hex, and he only controls the ground level location of that hex, even though he controls the entire building. So depending on how the victory conditions are worded, you need to be aware of the things you need to control within a hex, a building, and or a location. Again, depending on how the victory conditions are worded. The case we're going to look at here is how does a single man counter exert control? And in reality, he really doesn't. Let's say this building here is, this chateau is controlled by the Germans, and a Russian leader comes running up the road and jumps into the building. He controls nothing. He controls neither the building, the hex, or the location. Single man counters cannot gain control of anything, essentially, even heroes, which is a single man counter. Leaders and heroes cannot control anything, but there's always a but in ASL. Let's say this building is controlled by the Russians at some point and there's a leader inside. The German squad comes bebopping up the road and jumps in. The German does not control the building. He controls the hex and the ground floor location, but a leader or a single man counter can prevent control of a building, a hex, and or a location. So to summarize, single man counters cannot gain control of anything, but they can prevent control of anything. I think that's important because leaders are very mobile, especially heroes. They generally have a high morale level. They don't pin. They can just run around and control and capture things willy-nilly unless this rule did not exist. Number 32, section B9, my favorite. 7 pages about nothing but hedges and walls and bocage. But let's talk about hull down. Let's say we have this vehicle, happens to be in this woods hex, behind a wall. Now the owner of this German AFV has options here. If he's fired on by a direct hit weapon, he can either choose the TEM of the woods or the TEM of the wall. The TEM of the wall takes the form of being in a hull down position, meaning if the owner chooses to take the hull down position, whoever's firing on it has to get a turret hit in order to have an effect. So prior to announcing which TEM you're going to use, you might have to do a little math to determine, does the TEM give you an advantage, or does being hull down give you an advantage, only having to be hit on the turret for your opponent to have an effect? Sometimes it's pretty clear cut. Other times, depending on the situation, you may have to do a little math. So I would usually choose a hull down position because the chance of getting a turret hit is around 50-50 roughly. So if you're generally in a situation where the 2-hit roll is greater than 50%, you would probably choose the hull down position. Number 33, residual fire or rate of fire. You always have a choice, but you don't get both. Let's say we have this German squad with a medium machine gun that has a rate of fire of 2, and these American units are going to move into hex DD6, and the Germans happen to roll 2-6 on their defensive first fire against the American units, rolling a red 2. That means the machine gun retains rate of fire. Now you have a choice here, regardless of the outcome. You can choose to use the residual of the machine gun and place residual firepower in that hex, or you can maintain the rate of fire of the machine gun. If you choose to lay residual with the machine gun, you would place a first fire counter on both units. And you would leave 4 residual in the American unit's hex. Now if you chose to maintain rate of fire, you would leave 2 residual in the American unit's hex, mark just the squad first fired, and you'd maintain rate of fire in the medium machine gun to fire at another moving target later, or fire again on the American units because they spent 2 movement factors in that hex. So remember, you don't get to double dip on a lot of things in ASL, including rate of fire. You get to leave either residual firepower with a machine gun or maintain rate of fire if you happen to get rate of fire on your attack roll. Number 34, voluntary desperation morale. There are 2 things that can save the bacon of a squad, whether he's unbroken or broken. One I previously talked about in a bite-sized ASL, and that is voluntary break. If you are surrounded and in dire straits, during the rout phase, you can actually break your unit and rout him away from harm. Now, if you happen to have a broken unit on the board, they can only rout if they are under DM. Let's say this American unit routed from somewhere over here, and it's the beginning of the next rally phase. Like I said, he can only rout if he's under DM, and normally you remove desperation morale counters at the end of the rally phase, whether you're attempted to rally or not. But if you are not in a woods, building, pillbox, or trench, you can choose to keep the DM counter on your broken unit, thus ensuring he gets to continue routing. In this case, I'm in a grain field, assuming grain is in season. Even if that were open ground, it would still apply. At the end of the rally phase, I want to keep routing this guy because I want him to reach Sergeant Morin back here so he can get rallied. So I choose to leave the desperation morale counter on there so he can continue to rout. If I happen to take it off, he would no longer be able to rout unless he were fired upon. And that would be a choice that the opposing player would have to make. Often it's advantageous to keep units under DM. In this case, I would choose not to fire on this guy because he would not be able to rout if the owner took the DM counter off it. He would just be sitting in the grain field forever unless he happened to self-rally at some point or a leader ran to him and tried to rally him. So remember, try to keep DM counters on your units until they actually reach cover or a leader so they can rally. Number 35, infantry fire equivalent and rate of fire. Many weapons in the ASL system have what's called infantry fire equivalent, which is a number in parentheses here, the number 6. What that means is you can fire the weapon like a machine gun. There's no 2-hit process. So in this case, this 20 millimeter armored car could fire its main armament and fire with 6 firepower at any target in its covered arc. But if you choose to use infantry fire equivalent, your rate of fire would not be 2 in this case. It would be 1. Anytime you use infantry fire equivalent, which doesn't apply to machine guns, it has to be a number in parentheses, usually on guns and vehicles. If you use infantry fire equivalent, your rate of fire is reduced by 1. So if I were to fire this, the only way I could get rate of fire would be if I rolled something like a 1-4. If I rolled a 2-4 using infantry fire equivalent, I would not get rate of fire with this armored car. If I fired the 20 millimeter normally, its rate of fire would be 2, but the effectiveness of 20 millimeter HE is significantly reduced compared to using 6 infantry fire equivalent without having to use the 2-hit process. It's like a giant machine gun on wheels with a lower rate of fire.